Good evening, and welcome to the Walter Reed Theater and to this screening, which is part of the New York Film Festival's Masterwork series. I'm Richard Peña, the program director of the Film Society, and on behalf of the Film Society and the other members of the selection committee, I'd like to welcome you this evening. Sometimes when people talk about the New York Film Festival, they talk a lot about its links to foreign films, to international films. But I think the festival has a great record with American film, too, and probably never more so than in the late 60s, early 70s, when the promise of a really new and different and I think much richer American cinema was being fulfilled by filmmakers with names like Martin Scorsese and Peter Bogdanovich and Terrence Malick, all of whom had early films premiere at the festival. And in that group of really, I think, exciting new American films were coupled by a wonderful filmmaker whose work isn't shown enough, and we're so proud to have him here with this film. For me, a great favorite. The film had a huge impact on me when I saw it at the festival many years ago. Please welcome Bob Rafelson.
I've always thought it's not a very good idea for the director to introduce his films. If I were a midget, for example, you might think that the movie was a small movie. But what can I say? Here, I think almost to this very night, 40 years ago, the King of Marvin Gardens premiered here across the street at the Tilly. And I had a long history before then with Amos Vogel and Richard Roud. They were in many ways the people who introduced me to some of the more serious aspects of film, particularly Amos and his theater. So it's quite an extraordinary thing for me to be returning here after so many years. And I'm very grateful that you've come, all of you. And I think the best thing, well, let me try to tell you a little bit about the making of the film, but a very little. I wasn't sure after Five Easy Pieces what film I was going to make, and Jake Brackman and I got together. He was a young writer and somebody whose work I found remarkable, mostly his essays, his journalism. And we decided that we would write this movie together. And we were sort of auditioning one another because he hadn't written a movie before, and I'm not that easy to get along with. So we decided to do that. And then it came to casting. And I had in mind a young man that I had met years before. He was playing football for the Actors Studio team and in Central Park, and that was Bruce Dern. And I just found him so incredibly interesting, and over a number of years brought him out to Hollywood for television shows and other appearances. And I was absolutely persuaded that he was the right person to play the older brother that you may or may not know. This is a movie about brothers. I didn't want Jack Nicholson, curiously enough. So I came to New York and I interviewed another young actor. And we took long walks, I can remember. And eventually, he made this bad decision to, it was Al Pacino, to not appear in The King of Marvin Gardens, but to appear in The Godfather. Now, I mean, And then there was Ellen Burstyn, whom I had known for many, many years. I met her in a dart bar. We used to play darts together. And then the movie introduces quite a few characters that I don't think they had been in movies before, but you may recognize some of them, like Scatman Crothers and John Ryan and others. The picture finally, and by the way, while I was in New York, Jack was a very good friend. He had already written and co-produced a movie with me, my first, and then starred in 5 Easy Pieces, and then came 2 years later, The King of Marvin Gardens. And so he was a constant house guest, still is, and he knew I was in New York talking to somebody, some young actor. And so he stole into the study in the house and borrowed a copy of the script. Stole it. But of course I knew he was going to be at the house. I knew that he would be challenged if I was interviewing another actor, so all of it was sort of a way of beguiling him into doing the movie which he finally decided that he did want to do. And he's, in my view, very remarkable in this picture for acting like somebody who doesn't resemble the Jack Nicholson we have all come to know and all come to love. I love him for his extraordinary daring and for stealing the script. Thank you. Enjoy the movie.
Please welcome, once again, Bob Rafelson. Get comfortable. Mike's up a bit, please. Bob, if you could start off, just talk a little bit about, I mentioned this moment in Hollywood filmmaking history when we had our introduction. What was it like at that point? When we look back nowadays and see that era, there's so much creativity. The idea that a film like Marvin Gardens was possible seems incredible in the American scene now. What was it like in terms of Hollywood filmmaking, your relation to Hollywood, or just the scene at that time?
I met a young fellow in New York. I was working in New York.
A little closer to you.
And his name was Bert Schneider, who passed away this year. And we used to take long walks. And I said, I really would like to start a film company that had a different point of view. And I didn't know at the time whether I wanted to be a director or a producer. I used to talk about these things, whether I wanted to be Kurosawa or Sam Spiegel. Yeah. Imagine the hubris to choose between those two. In any event, we decided to form a company, and I thought that Bert, and I was right, what I felt was that America had considerable talent, but that we lacked a talent to recognize talent. And I thought Bert would be the perfect person to nurture those people. And we decided to form a company. That this is in the mid to late 60s. And strangely, it was all about wanting to make feature films, but there was one television show that was quasi-autobiographical about myself being an itinerant musician in Mexico. And that became the Monkees of all things, and it became a huge success. And as a result of the Monkees, And eventually, Easy Rider, when I say eventually, that was only a couple of years later, we were able to make a deal with Columbia Pictures, which allowed us to do any picture we wanted to make. No script was submitted, no cast was submitted. We were mad people set loose on the public. And they gave us those permissions because the other things had been so successful. So the first thing was, well, who's going to make the movies? And if you're going to create a company where you think that the important thing is the director, which, by the way, was up until that point in America, the director wasn't that important. The producers were important. The studio was important. Darling Lily would be the great contemporary hit at the same year that we started making movies. And I picked people, some of whom I knew for a very, very long time. Dennis Hopper and I had known Dennis when he was 15 years old. And curiously, when I moved to Los Angeles years later, we wound up living in houses adjacent to one another. And he would say to me, Bob, I want to direct a Monkees episode. And I'd say, no, Dennis. You don't want to direct a Monkees episode. And Martin Scorsese was one of those guys, and Francis Coppola was one of those guys. Because the show, although if you look back on it now, it seems very conventional, broke a lot of barriers. And for example, the first 39 shows that we made, I think 37 were directed by people who never directed before. I directed a few. And with this new permission, and you can't believe how this was a dream come true for me that Bert delivered for me. The ability to make whatever movie we wanted to make. Can you cut that out for a second?
Sorry.
Just give, leave me alone. Anyway, so Dennis was one of the first people. I made a picture called Head, which was our first production with the Monkees, and everybody advised me, for God's sakes, don't make a monkey movie. And I had in mind a very different thing for the movie from the television show. And we were simultaneously preparing a movie with Dennis Hopper called Easy Rider. And strangely, we decided to call the picture Head, because it was titled something else, because Bert thought that we should be able to promote Easy Rider by saying, from the producers who gave you Head. But nobody went to see Head. Head opened up in a cinema not more than 2 minutes from here. At the time, it was called El Estudio Cinema, and it was the first English language film to play in that theater. And the idea of that was that we were being advised by Marshall McLuhan's associate, John Brockman, to open the picture without mentioning the Monkees, because they were anathema by that time to the audience. So there was no mention whatsoever. And I can remember the very last day prior to the opening of the picture at El Estudio Cinema, Jack and I began to get very nervous about this campaign. No mention of where the picture's opening, no mention of, I mean, it's one thing to be anonymous, but this was being this was being alien, beyond anonymous. So we were walking down Fifth Avenue, and we were posting these little stickers everywhere we could that said head, 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 head. There was no suggestion of that it was a movie or a cast or anything, just head. And in fact, with John Brockman, who at the time was a philosopher and a McLuhanist, it was his picture on head. It didn't relate to the movie at all. But he said that didn't make any difference, because it was supposed to be my head. I said, well, nobody knows what I look like. So he said, and he said, well, that doesn't make any difference. I said, well, if it doesn't make any difference, he was framing me for the poster. I said, you sit there, and I took his picture, and we put his picture on the poster, and put his picture on, and it went all over every toilet in America. Head, 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 head. And Jack took one of these stickers, and there was a vendor selling chestnuts on Fifth Avenue, and Jack thought it would be a great idea to take one of the stickers, and because the cops were busting this poor fellow, to stick one of the stickers on his helmet, and the poor guy turned around just at the last moment, gets it in the face. Jack and I are up against a wall, and we're both busted, but he stays in jail, and I think this is our big break. And I tell the cops, look, we're producers. We're opening up a movie tonight. This is the opening night of our first movie, a big movie, at the El Studio Cinema. Well, the cops think we're fucking nuts. Anyway, that was the first movie. But after that came Hopper, and then I made, I think, 5 Easy Pieces. And then somewhere along the line, Bogdanovich made the last picture. All of these pictures, by the way, or no, many of them, played here at the New York Film Festival. So it's quite extraordinary for me to be back. I have to tell you, this place established and supported the idea of independent cinema before it was even known as such. Now, if I haven't answered your question, please don't make me.
Let me ask you one more before I turn it over to the audience. I want to ask, during this time, I mean, you mentioned the festival, and before we were talking about Amos Vogel, were all of you, Hopper, I guess Bogdanovich, the others, did you think of yourselves in conversation with, say, some of the European filmmakers of the time, the New Wave, et cetera?
Yeah, a little more than the New Wave, actually, because I was never really conscientious student of film, but I certainly knew about Italian cinema right after the war, Vittorio De Sica and Rossellini and so on and so forth. And I certainly knew about the French directors who followed in the New Wave. And I certainly knew about, to me, a vastly overlooked era of English cinema, sort of the last angry man cinema of Osborne, of Tony Richardson, anyway, all these young directors who were working for Woodfall Productions in London, and they were all influences on this decision to create our own cinema, an American cinema. Quite definitely. Yeah.
Okay, let's get some questions from you. Yes, sir.
Since all your films have great acting, I was just wondering, what's your style of directing actors? Do you have a lot of notes for them, or do you just kind of let them play?
Let me repeat the question. The question's about, since in all of Bob Rafelson's films there's just such extraordinary acting, how does he direct actors? Does he have notes? Do you rehearse the actors? What is it?
Every picture is different, and every actor is different. And I always believe that the most important thing for the director was to speak the language of the actor. And if the actor was not trained in the actor's studio, or if the actor didn't like to rehearse, or if the actor desperately needed, I remember working with one actor. At the time we called them actresses, but it's become weird to call anybody an actress anymore, but I can remember one actor, actress, whose hand I had to hold whenever I shot her close-up. She was just terrified. She's won at least 3 Academy Awards, so I won't tell you who it was. I always felt that it was very important to find my own colloquy, my own language with the actor, and not to require them to understand my language. And so it worked completely differently with some actors, line readings. Some actors, Nicholson, very unusual. You would never think the way you might think of Bob De Niro, for example, who so industriously researches each part and becomes a 600-pound fat man. And Nicholson, you wouldn't think that he does that sort of thing, but I would call every now and then. I remember on Postman, and I asked his associate, his secretary, his assistant, well, what's Jack doing? And she said, well, at the moment he's looking in the mirror. And I said, well, what's he doing? Well, he's working on the part. He's working on the look of the person. So Jack, and after a while, strangely, because we made so many movies together, the other actors in the pictures became resentful because they couldn't understand how it was that Jack and I could communicate so swiftly. Well, by this time we were siblings. When I made 5 Easy Pieces, Jack and I shared a motel room and a girlfriend or two. And then I can remember years later, in Postman, for example, he had a trailer, and he had, we didn't have trailers in the early days, and I can remember knocking on the door and wanting to talk to Jack about a part and a scene, and the guy wouldn't let me in the trailer. Things had changed so radically with his stardom. But in every movie, because I continued to make movies until rather recently, actually, he's somebody who really likes the work. I also, in response to your question, although I'm not absolutely sure I remember it, I felt that I should have open casting calls. In other words, it wasn't agents who sent people in, it was anybody who wanted to read for the part. I saw them. And so for any given movie, I might read 200 actors for the same part. It was exhausting, but in some ways it was great for me because it also refined how the scenes were going to be played, how I might alter them before the actual shooting. I learned a great deal from that casting, and a lot of the people were unknowns. Half the people in this movie were total unknowns. Now, I haven't seen the goddamn movie in so long I can't tell you who they were, but I do remember there's a lot of unknowns in that picture.
Yes, sir, right there. Questions about the collaboration of Bob with Laszlo Kovacs.
Yeah. My first picture had, I needed to shoot a particular sequence, and there was this photographer whom I knew. Some of these questions are a bit complex, because Nicholson and I became friends at a cinema club in Los Angeles, sort of an underground cinema club, showed mostly avant-garde films and foreign films. And we met in the dark. But he was making motorcycle movies, And he was playing the C part or the B part, and he felt his career was going nowhere, and so he decided to switch and to become a producer, a writer, which is how come he wrote and produced Head with me. But he introduced me to tons of people that I had not known, including the lady who wrote 5 Easy Pieces, and including Laszlo Kovacs, who had photographed one or two of the... Now, I knew about Laszlo, because Laszlo and Vilmos Zsigmond... Now, I bet you can name a lot of Vilmos Zsigmond pictures, and I can't.
McCabe and Mrs. Miller, Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
Right, Academy Award winner, and a co-Hungarian. And they had escaped from Hungary in 1955, something like that, and shot their escape. In other words, they photographed each other eluding the police and going through forests and whatnot. And I had seen that picture, so I was thrilled to ask him to photograph a sequence in Head, and then he became the man who would photograph 5 Easy Pieces and The King of Marvin Gardens. Now, the collaboration was really interesting because I had notions. You know, when you're very young and you're starting out with making pictures, you think that you're inventing cinema. How innocent and perverse a thought that is, you know. So I, for 5 Easy Pieces, had a directorial style in mind, and then it was sort of evolved for the movie you've just seen. First of all, as a result of doing Head and the Monkeys, where I had thousands of 2-frame cuts, everything very rock and roll, very quick, very fast, I decided I never wanted to do that again. So I was really interested for the first time in working with actors and trying to find a style of movie that suited acting. Which is not to say you ignore photography. There's some kinds of photographers who are very, let's see, who would you know? Martin Scorsese is somebody, for example, who likes to move the camera and move it rather elaborately. I had been translating Japanese movies into English in Japan, and had worked on Ozu's movies, and I was profoundly influenced by the stillness of the camera. So by the time this came about, I wanted to have as little cutting as possible, and I was so self-conscious about it that I actually counted the amount of cuts in each film, and I wanted them to be less and less and less as time goes. I mean, putting a numerical count, now who gives a shit about that? Nobody. Only some very egocentric director would care about a thing like that, and I was one of those. So I made his Fuga. So in this film, this is the fewest cuts I ever had in any movie. I tried to evolve a camera technique that allowed the actors to roam and be within the frame. And there's lots of things I could tell you about it. One of them was that on the exteriors, the camera doesn't move at all, which means, imagining that we were all outside at the moment, that you were sitting in an outdoor stadium and I was on the stage in an outdoor stadium, but you could be in Hoboken, since I was photographing in this direction, and I could be in Paris, because the two cuts never connected, which allowed me to reinvent the geography of Atlantic City. So half the scenes you see in the picture, when you see the people looking at a given thing, that's shot miles away from where, in fact, it looks as if they're all in the same proximity. Anyway, I love that man greatly, Laszlo.
Yes, gentleman here.
Did you have much personal experience with Atlantic City prior to getting involved in King of Marvin Gardens?
Did you know much about Atlantic City prior to getting involved in King of Marvin
No, I
Gardens?
didn't know hardly anything. Jake Brackman was raised in part of his life in Atlantic City, and when we collaborated on the script, it was he who suggested, I wanted it to be in a resort, I think, and Jake said, well, why not Atlantic City? And I said, well, I don't really know very much about it. But with the very decadence of the place and the magisterial quality of it, you know, these huge edifices. Remember, this picture was shot in '71, so Atlantic City didn't change until 20 years later and become what it is, I guess what it is now, the kind of Trump hotels and stuff like that. But it was Jake who actually came up with Atlantic City, and I flipped out when I went there to check it out.
Yes, over here, sir.
You mentioned that you hadn't seen the film in many years, so I'm wondering how you think it looked, and if you have any thoughts on the fact that tonight's screening was in digital and not in film.
Yeah, the question was, if you haven't seen the film, you said you hadn't seen the film in a long time. He's wondering if you saw it tonight, how did it
No,
look
I
to
didn't
you?
see it tonight.
So-
I can't go to see these movies. And I'll tell you something about that as well. I've always been a very deliberate and painstaking editor of the work. I believe it is the only time that you have an opportunity. You know, when you write the script, you believe in the execution of it during the course of the making of the movie, and you are exposed in the editing process to your foolishness and to your miscalculations, and so it's an opportunity to change the movie, and I edited for a very, very long time. It take a lot of time. It's built into the schedule. These are all low budget efforts, and after that, when the picture is completed, there is a process called timing, which has to do with the getting the colors of the thing absolutely as close to what you intended, or perhaps to even change your mind and to alter that. But that's your last chance. And so you sit in a little tiny room, I would say about 1/10 the size of this theater, and you watch over and over and over again 10, 12 times with a man called the timer, no sound, the precise coloring until it's exactly right, or until the timer dies.
The other question was about digital, in terms of how do you think of digital versus film copies?
Well, I'm going to get to that in a second.
Sorry.
I used to, after all of this was done and the sound was now married, I would look at 150 prints. So how many hours is that? That's, well, this thing is 2 hours long. Somebody can do the math, but it's a long time I'm spending looking at, because I believe that that every print that went out had some small, meager variation, and it might be shown in Ohio, or it might be shown in New York, or it might be shown in, and I wanted Stanley Kubrick looked at 1,000. So if you want to talk about nutcases, and I know one time he was in Australia. In fact, it was the last time he traveled outside the country. He went to see, I think it was 2001, he went to see a print in a theater, and it was all scratchy and ugly, and the colors were way off, and he went completely nuts and went into the projection room and ripped the thing apart. And took the can of film and busted it up and whatnot. No, I was never as, well, he might argue, I was never as wacky as Stanley. But 1,000 prints is a lot of prints to look at. So by the time you get finished, you don't want to ever look at the movie again. And that's why I didn't see it tonight. I kind of know it by now. And it's not, it has nothing to do with, oh, I wish I could have changed that. Never had that point of view at all. And I don't ever remember having wanting to have improved upon it. It is what it was, and what it was what I wanted to make at the time, and that's all there is to it. And I had final cut, so I don't believe in director's cuts. It is the movie I wanted to make. As to digital, this is a whole other question, and I know it's one that the younger people are really profoundly interested in. I've made a movie in Berlin once, 3 days, with a digital camera. The thing was about this big, and it wasn't a long movie. But I have nothing against. In fact, quite the opposite. People ask often, well, what is the future of movies? Well, who the hell knows? I do know that I didn't know what the future of movies was when we started the BBS pictures. And that was considered incredibly revolutionary, but only for about 3 or 4 years. And then Steven Spielberg made Jaws, and the blockbuster was born, and the whole idea of independent, autonomous cinema or auteur cinema disappeared very quickly. But for a while, it had its impact. And the idea of a screen having to be this large as opposed to this large, and what is a cinema? Well, I could talk forever about it, but I'm not very knowledgeable. But my 2 children, I have 2 children, one 9, one 13, and their idea of what images are and what exhibition is on Facebook or YouTube is entirely different from mine. And they look at me as being very old-fashioned and conservative, and I look at them as being radically insane.
Bob, as you were involved as a producer and really kind of the head of the company, one of the people who ran the company, could you talk a little bit about marketing and distribution of these films or all the BBS films? Marketing especially, I'm thinking nowadays, these films don't fit into easy pigeonholes, and that's always the problem.
The first and most important objective was to get it accepted by the New York Film Festival, and I'm not shitting. That was the key. And always the picture showed here, and then, well, at least 3 easy pieces, Marvin Gardens and the last picture show. And always the objective was to release the picture from the impetus of the festival itself. And no, we didn't know that these pictures were going to be received well at the festival, but if they were, that's what became the marketing premise. And we opened the pictures very, very slowly. The idea was that the audience should discover the movie, and it was their opportunity to kind of participate by saying, hey, I saw a movie last night, and then tell their friends. And that was the basis of the campus. So we had very little money to spend on the movies. And remember, the people who were in these movies were not movie stars, and the people who were directing them were not well-known directors. So it was basically, how do you get a movie exposed sufficiently, smallly, modestly, sufficiently so that an audience could build very, very slowly. Now, today, this is entirely opposite. And for those of you who are under 40 in the audience. I can't see any of you. I've got a huge light in my face. Pictures today open in 4,000 theaters at once. I never had a picture. All of my pictures together have never played in 4,000 theaters. Literally, I mean that. So this is a kind of new phenomenon also, the idea of exposing everything with a bundle of money. We didn't have that. It was, let the people discover the movie. Let word of mouth carry it. And we were lucky. The plain, simple fact of the matter is we were lucky.
How important were foreign sales to the equation?
Well, in the beginning, they weren't important at all, but it turned out that our pictures, many of them, most of them, certainly all of mine, were more popular in Europe than they were here, which pissed me off. I was trying to make this an American movement and American cinema, and here it was being appreciated by the Europeans more than by the Americans. Now, that's not to say that Easy Rider wasn't a vast success here, and so was Easy Piece, and so was Last Picture Show. But they were more successful in Europe, And later on in my life, all the money, all of my pictures were made independently, and almost all of them were financed in Europe, where my reputation exceeded by far my skills.
Time for one or two more? Yes, right over this.
The last shot of the movie with a home movie on the staircase, do you recall that being an accident, or was it written in the screenplay? Was it something you came up once you actually were projecting it?
Okay, I'm
The
sorry.
very last shot of the film.
Yes.
And was that something that you had planned, or did it come up during the shooting, or really what's the origin of that last shot?
You mean the grandfather looking at the film,
The film,
They don't see the kids playing on the staircase.
right,
the two kids
right.
building a sandcastle? Well, let me tell you about those two kids. I was looking for two children, and I was shot that piece of film on 8mm, and I was looking for two kids, and I went to the school, and in the schoolyard, maybe 100 children were playing, and I said, and that one over there, I think I like that young man. And the principal said, fine, okay, wrote his name down. And then I waited for another recess, and another 100 kids were playing in the yard. And I said, and that one over there, I think I like that young man. He said, well, that's very interesting, they're brothers. Really, it's happened. And so that you get some kind of a wacky piece of luck like that, and you just say, okay, so those are the two kids. And we rehearsed that scene. I knew that the grandfather would be looking at it. What I did not know was that, if I recall, Nicholson finally leaves the room, and the door opens, and the picture, isn't it? Doesn't it go on to them as he's going up the stairs?
Kids are on the stairs.
Yeah. So it's projected onto Nicholson's departure, and then the grandfather shuts the door? Is that what happens? Okay, so there was an accident there. There were lots, I believe, totally encouraging. Now, this is a terrible thing to say, because it's very hard to encourage accidents. It's sort of like encouraging miscarriages or something. I mean, you don't go running around saying, I want an atmosphere where everybody can break their legs. But I did want an atmosphere where things could take place by accident. So, for example, at the end of this movie, there's a scene where Ellen Burstyn shoots her husband. Okay, now the young girl in the picture, Julia Ann Robinson, the night before, shooting this scene, cut off all of her hair. And when I turned, I said, "My God Almighty, what have you done, Julie? It won't match anything you looked like during the course of the movie." And she said, "Well, my mother did it." There's a very fine line between, in some actors' sensibilities, between what's real and the parts they're playing. And I encourage the evaporation of that line, and it sometimes is dangerous and harmful. I mean that, because if actors get so lost in the part, they can turn out to be psychotic. And Julia cut off all of her hair. So Jake sat with me, we were terrified, and said, "Okay, we'll lock her in the shower for the entire scene. She won't run around." And so when she comes out of the shower with wet hair, she has very minimalistic hair, but you don't see her very much during the course of that scene. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that you have to rewrite the ending of the movie, because I think at the time she was going to wind up with Jack Nicholson at the end of the movie. So the accident changed not only the scene, but the end of the movie as well. And in the course of the scene, Ellen goes to the bathroom and tries to turn off the shower. And it wouldn't go off by accident. And I just held the camera there. And she said, "Please, please, please." I find it very moving myself. Or I did 20 years ago when I saw the fucking movie. She couldn't get the shower off. And that's an accident. And I can tell you that this is throughout all of my movies. And I feel very privileged that there's enough of an atmosphere for us to be flexible and ride the change.
Bob, we'd keep you here all night, but maybe we want to say goodnight?
Good night.
Thank you so much for coming, Bob Rafelson.